Play the basement footage right now. Let's see who was really visiting the maintenance lockers at midnight.
You thought playing the hero would get you a massive reward, didn't you? A kid from your background doesn't understand true honesty.
My mother taught me that if we lose our honesty, we lose everything. I came to return what belongs to Mr. James, not to sell it.
An 18-year-old boy stood on the shivering corner of East Market Street in Akron, Ohio, his thin jacket completely powerless against the freezing December wind. The air tasted like cold iron and spent industrial exhaust, pressing heavy against his hollow chest as the gray winter afternoon began to die. He adjusted the frayed collar of his faded flannel shirt, ensuring it covered the small, purple scar near his collarbone. It was the only clean garment he owned, washed carefully every single night in the sink of a nearby gas station. He needed to look presentable, even if the rest of the world only saw a shadow moving against the brick walls. His name was Marcus Fletcher. He had spent the last 3 hours walking from storefront to storefront, asking for nothing but a broom and a chance to sweep the slush off their entryways. Every single manager had looked down at his worn-out, taped-up sneakers before shaking their heads without a word. One store owner even pulled the security latch shut right in front of his face, the sharp metallic click echoing louder than the freezing wind. People in the city had a way of deciding who you were long before you ever opened your mouth. They judged your entire worth by the mud on your soles and the hunger in your eyes. Marcus walked past a quiet, upscale coffee shop where steam rolled off the windows in thick, inviting waves. A tall man stepped out of the heavy glass door, a plain paper cup held tightly in his hand while his eyes remained fixed on a ringing phone. He wore a heavy black winter coat, dark designer jeans, and a simple wool beanie pulled low over his forehead, half hiding his face from the casual observer. There were no cameras around him, no bright lights, and no security guards clearing the sidewalk ahead of his steps. He moved quickly, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind, as he turned sharply down the main avenue. Marcus did not know much about sports or global fame, having spent the last 4 years fighting just to find a dry piece of cardboard to sleep on. But anyone who lived in this part of Ohio recognized that massive frame, that quiet, purposeful stride that belonged to a man who had conquered the world but always came back to the soil he grew up on. It was LeBron James, walking the streets of his hometown without a single ounce of pretense. As the tall man reached into his coat pocket to silence his phone, a thick object slipped out unnoticed. It tumbled silently into a patch of dirty gray slush right next to the concrete curb. The street was starting to clear as the evening commute picked up, but nobody stopped to look down at the ground. Nobody noticed the dark brown leather wallet sitting in the freezing mud. Nobody except Marcus. He stepped forward slowly, his boots squelching against the wet snow as he bent down to retrieve the heavy object. The leather was incredibly smooth, smelling of expensive cedar and high-end craftsmanship, the kind of luxury Marcus had only ever seen through reinforced glass windows. His cold, stiff fingers trembled violently as he unzipped the main compartment. Inside, rows of crisp high-denominator bills sat perfectly aligned. More money than Marcus had ever seen in his entire existence. There were sleek black cards with gold lettering, and tucked behind them was a state driver's license displaying the unmistakable face of the man who had just walked away. The sheer weight of the cash made Marcus catch his breath, his stomach twisting into a painful tight knot that reminded him he had not eaten a solid meal in 48 hours. This money could instantly buy a warm apartment, a month of hot food, new boots, and a real winter coat for his ailing grandmother. Nobody had seen him pick it up from the slush. The street was empty, and the billionaire would never even feel the loss. 2 older men, sheltering under the awning of a closed pawn shop across the street, watched Marcus stare into the open wallet. One of them spat onto the snow and called out, telling the boy that God had finally given him a winning lottery ticket. The other man laughed hoarsely, advising Marcus to run as fast as his broken shoes could carry him before someone came back looking for it. Marcus closed the leather wallet with a slow, deliberate snap. He felt the heavy pull of his empty stomach, the constant, exhausting pressure of survival urging him to take the easy way out. Then he looked down at his wrist, where a cheap, faded rubber band sat tightly against his skin. He took a deep breath, turning his back on the men and walking directly toward the towering, modern glass structure at the end of the block. The sign near the entrance read, "The Summit Development and Educational Foundation," a massive philanthropic organization funded by the city's most famous son. Well-dressed executives and lawyers in tailored overcoats moved through the revolving doors, completely ignoring the shivering boy who stood near the entrance. Marcus gripped the wallet tightly inside his jacket pocket, his heart drumming furiously against his ribs as he stepped into the heated lobby. Two large security guards in sharp, navy blue uniforms immediately moved to intercept him before he could even reach the reception desk. The taller guard looked at Marcus's taped sneakers, his face hardening into an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He demanded to know what a stray kid was doing loitering in a private corporate facility during business hours. Marcus explained softly that he had found something highly valuable on the sidewalk and needed to return it directly to the owner. He pulled the wallet out just enough for the guard to see the gold initials stamped on the dark leather. The guard didn't offer a word of thanks. Instead, his hand shot forward like a whip, grabbing Marcus by the wrist and twisting his arm backward. He shouted for his partner, calling Marcus a filthy thief who had clearly picked a pocket outside the coffee shop. The second guard slammed Marcus against the cold marble pillar, forcing his arms behind his back as people in the lobbies stopped to watch. Several executives shook their heads in disapproval, whispering about how dangerous the downtown area had become lately. They dragged the boy down a narrow, windowless corridor and threw him into a small security room, slamming the heavy metal door shut. Marcus sat in the hard plastic chair, his wrist throbbing in pain as he forced himself to stare at the blank wall, refusing to let them see him cry. The room was perfectly quiet, except for the low, rhythmic hum of a ventilation fan hidden somewhere in the ceiling grid. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a harsh, flickering intensity that made Marcus's eyes burn as he sat entirely motionless. He kept his hands resting on his knees, watching the tiny red light of a security camera mounted in the far corner of the room. The air inside this concrete box felt dead and sterile, smelling faintly of institutional bleach and old, dusty upholstery. It was a space designed to make a person feel small, to strip away whatever confidence they had left before the questions even began. Outside these walls, the city of Akron was slowly burying itself under another heavy layer of thick, gray December snow. Marcus closed his eyes and allowed his mind to drift back to the small, drafts-ridden room he occupied on the north side of town. The apartment was located above an abandoned auto body shop, where the smell of motor oil still leaked through the floorboards. In the corner of that room, his grandmother sat wrapped in 3 layers of mismatched, donated quilts, her breathing shallow and raspy. He had spent the morning trying to seal the cracks in the window frame with strips of old newspaper. But the winter cold always found a way inside. Every single detail of his daily routine was a calculated battle against the complete chaos of having absolutely nothing. He woke up every morning at precisely 5 o'clock to walk down to the community center to collect a small plastic jug of clean water. He would use a fraction of that water to scrub his single flannel shirt, hanging it near the small radiator until the fabric was stiff. The rest of his day was spent pounding the pavement, mapping out every business within a 4-mile radius that might need temporary labor. He never asked for a handout, and he never held out his hand for spare change at the highway exit ramps. He believed with an unshakable, quiet desperation that hard work was the only bridge that could carry him out of the dark. By the time mid-afternoon arrived, his stomach would begin to twist with a familiar, dull ache that he had learned to treat as a companion. He remembered the small grocery store on Copley Road, where the owner sometimes left slightly bruised apples in a wooden crate near the loading dock. Marcus would only take one, always leaving a small, handwritten note of thanks on a scrap of paper tucked under the crate. He treated the world with an old-fashioned, deliberate respect, even when the world treated him like an invisible ghost. It was the only way he knew how to keep the street from changing who he was on the inside. A heavy set of footsteps echoed down the tiled hallway outside the security office, breaking the long, heavy silence. The doorknob turned with a sharp, metallic click, and the heavy steel door swung open to reveal the head of security. He did not look at Marcus. Instead, he stood by the doorframe, holding a digital tablet and cross-referencing a set of internal incident reports. The man's uniform was perfectly pressed, his silver badge gleaming under the harsh lights, representing a world of absolute order and zero tolerance. He stepped aside to let a second individual enter the room, a man whose presence immediately shifted the temperature of the air. As Marcus sat in the stifling silence of the security room, the sharp sting of the guard's grip still burning on his wrist, he forced his gaze downward to his own lap. His eyes locked onto the faded neon-green rubber band resting against his dark skin, a stark contrast to the sterile gray environment. This simple object was not just a piece of discarded plastic. It was his anchor, a physical manifestation of a time when his life had a completely different trajectory. His thumb gently traced the debossed, worn-out letters stretching across the surface, reading the words, "I promise by touch alone." The band was stretched thin, losing its original elasticity, yet it remained the most valuable possession he carried through the unforgiving winter streets. The rubber band had been given to him 4 years ago on a bright, humid morning that felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. He remembered the crowded auditorium of the community school, the scent of fresh floor wax, and the overwhelming sea of nervous children standing in perfectly straight rows. Marcus had stood near the back, his chest swelling with pride as a large, warm hand clapped him firmly on the shoulder, presenting the band as a covenant. It was a solemn pledge between a global icon who had conquered the world and a scared kid from the rough blocks of North Akron. The promise was simple yet monumental. Stay in school, respect your community, and keep your integrity intact, no matter how hard the wind blew against your face. Marcus closed his eyes tightly, allowing the memory to fully submerge him, drowning out the low hum of the security camera above his head. He could still hear his mother's voice echoing through the quiet chambers of his mind, her words always carrying the weight of absolute truth. She had sat by his bedside during her final days, her face drawn and exhausted, but her eyes burning with an unshakable fierce intensity. "Even if the world strips away our home, Marcus, it can never strip away the honesty we choose to carry in our hearts," she had whispered. "If you lose your integrity, you become truly poor, invisible to the angels, and enslaved by your own desperate choices." Those words had become his shield when the darkness finally came for him after the funeral lanterns had burned out completely. When the landlord threw his belongings into the rain-soaked alley because the rent money was 3 weeks late, Marcus did not steal. When the older boys on the corner offered him a crisp $100 bill just to stand watch at the mouth of the alley, he walked away. He had spent countless nights shivering beneath the rusted metal fire escapes, his ribs aching with an empty, hollow hunger that screamed for a quick fix. Yet, every single time temptation crept into his mind, his fingers would find the rubber band, and his mother's voice would steady his racing pulse. Now trapped inside a corporate holding cell and branded as a common criminal, the memory felt heavier than it ever had before. The world was demanding that he regret his honesty, pushing him to believe that his mother's lessons were nothing but foolish dreams for people who could afford them. The wealthy executives in the lobby had looked at his ragged clothes and immediately written a story of guilt and malice in their minds. But Marcus kept his chin up, his posture straight, and his breathing completely steady as he waited for the door to open. He knew who he was, and no amount of concrete walls or false accusations could alter the truth written on his soul. The heavy steel door swung inward with a sharp, metallic groan, and Preston Vance stepped into the tiny security room. He was a man whose presence was defined by expensive tailoring and absolute authority, wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that fell perfectly around his frame. His silver hair was combed back with mathematical precision, and his eyes carried the cold, analytical detachment of someone who dealt exclusively in profit margins and liability risks. As the chief financial officer of the elite asset management firm handling the foundation's endowments, he looked at Marcus as if the boy were nothing more than a smudge of dirt on an otherwise immaculate spreadsheet. He didn't bother to sit down across from Marcus. Instead, he stood with his leather-gloved hands folded tightly behind his back, towering over the plastic chair. He looked at the dark brown leather wallet resting on the metal table, then glanced down at Marcus's soaked, taped sneaker with an expression of profound weariness. He began to speak in a low, measured tone that carried no anger, only a chilling, self-righteous certainty that cut deeper than any shout could have managed. He stated that people like Marcus were a predictable element in a city like Akron, driven entirely by basic desperation and a total lack of discipline. He explained that the foundation was built on rigorous standards, and allowing a vagrant child to loiter near corporate assets was an unacceptable breach of operational security. Marcus did not flinch, keeping his eyes fixed entirely on Vance's polished leather dress shoes as the man continued his quiet assault. Vance leaned down slightly, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper as he told Marcus that trying to play the hero by bringing the wallet inside was a pathetic, transparent tactic. He accused the boy of planning to demand a massive reward, or worse, using the opportunity to scout the executive floors for something else to carry out into the night. He called Marcus a symptom of a broken neighborhood, a kid who would inevitably end up behind bars, because people of his background simply lacked the moral capacity to understand true honesty. The security guards stood by the door, nodding along with every word their superior uttered, their faces twisted into identical masks of arrogant agreement. A secretary stepped into the room briefly to deliver a document, lowering her eyes and shifting her posture uncomfortably as she caught the tail end of Vance's speech. She avoided looking at Marcus entirely, her silent withdrawal making the small room feel even more hostile and isolating than before. The entire world inside this multi-million-dollar building was uniting against him, assuming his guilt simply because he didn't possess the wealth to buy their trust. Yet, despite the intense weight of the humiliation pressing down on his shoulders, Marcus remained completely motionless, absorbing the insults with a quiet, monumental dignity. He did not cry, he did not raise his voice, and he did not offer a desperate defense of his character to a man who had already judged him. He kept his breathing slow and steady, his fingers gently resting near the faded green rubber band around his wrist, drawing strength from the silent promise it represented. He knew that Vance's cruelty came from a place of immense corporate pride and deep personal insecurity, and he refused to let the man's bitter words break his spirit. The heavy metal door of the security room opened for the second time, but there was no aggressive slam or warning click. A towering figure stepped into the cramped space, and the two security guards immediately pulled their shoulders back. their rigid postures betraying a sudden, intense nervousness. LeBron James stood in the doorway, his massive frame nearly filling the entrance as he pulled off his wool beanie and cast a long, quiet glance across the sterile room. The expensive charcoal overcoat he wore was dusted with fresh Akron snow, but his expressions carried no theatrical anger, only a profound, searching stillness that immediately silenced Preston Vance mid-sentence. He didn't speak to Vance or acknowledge the guard's frantic attempts to explain the situation. Instead, he walked directly to the metal table where his dark leather wallet sat resting in the center. LeBron picked it up with a slow, deliberate movement, unzipping the main compartment and observing the thick rows of cash that remained perfectly undisturbed, exactly as it had fallen into the slush outside. His large fingers paused as he reached deep into a hidden interior fold, extracting a small, twice-folded slip of white paper that had been tucked away from view. He smoothed out the creases with his thumb, reading the hurried handwriting silently, as a brief, intense flicker of understanding passed behind his dark eyes before his face returned to a mask of absolute calm. The note was a private memo LeBron had written to himself weeks ago after noticing deep, unexplainable discrepancies in the regional financial reports for the Foundation's primary educational programs. It contained a single damning directive. Check the Akron North accounts. Someone is stealing from the kids. The room became completely devoid of sound, the heavy silence pressing against the ears of everyone present as Vance watched the paper with a sudden, carefully asked look of intense panic. If the boy in the chair had intended to rob him, the cash would have been gone long before anyone noticed. If the boy had wanted to manufacture a lie, he could never have known the exact hidden contents of that private scrap of internal evidence. LeBron slowly folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, turning his attention entirely toward the shivering 18-year-old sitting in the plastic chair. He observed the ragged sneakers, the thin flannel shirt, and then his eyes locked onto the faded neon green rubber band stretched tightly around Marcus' dark wrist. He recognized the band instantly, knowing the exact weight of the promise it carried and the fierce, protective pride of the children who wore them through the toughest neighborhoods of his hometown. LeBron looked at Vance, his voice dropping into a low, resonant rumble that carried the undeniable weight of an absolute ruler reclaiming his court, ordering the executives and the guards to leave the room immediately. When the heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving only the global icon and the homeless boy alone under the buzzing fluorescent lights, LeBron pulled up a second chair and sat down directly across from Marcus. He asked the boy in a quiet, conversational tone why he hadn't kept the money when the street was completely empty and his hunger was so transparently deep. Marcus met his gaze without a single flinch, explaining that his mother had taught him before she passed away that losing one's honesty meant losing everything, and that he had fought too hard to keep that single promise alive. LeBron listened with a slow, understanding nod, realizing that this boy possessed the exact rare integrity that his foundation was built to protect, and he quietly offered Marcus a temporary position in the building's maintenance department, promising him no handouts, only a hard, grueling chance to prove his worth while the real investigation began in the dark floors above. The winter days inside the towering corporate headquarters began to blur into a long, exhausting routine of physical labor and silent endurance for Marcus. He arrived every morning at exactly 7:55, ignoring the cold glares from the front desk staff who looked at his oversized maintenance uniform as if it were a stain on the marble floor. Preston Vance had placed him under the direct supervision of an aggressive floor manager who had been instructed to find any possible excuse to terminate the boy's employment. Marcus spent his hours lifting heavy crates of industrial cleaning chemicals, scrubbing the grout lines of the executive restrooms and emptying the overflowing trash bins of senior staff who deliberately dropped their coffee grounds onto the floor right as he walked past. He never uttered a single word of complaint, keeping his head down and allowing his broom to speak for his work ethic, knowing that every perfectly cleaned room was a silent shield against their malice. As the weeks advanced, the tension inside the building began to tighten like a piano wire, driven by an invisible, systematic audit that LeBron James had initiated behind closed doors. Preston Vance began to realize that his elaborate network of shell companies and falsified donor receipts was slowly being unraveled by an external team of forensic accountants. Becoming increasingly desperate to halt the investigation, Vance turned his anger entirely toward the maintenance boy, viewing Marcus as the catalyst for his impending ruin. One evening, after the office floors had emptied, Vance personally navigated the basement corridors and located the small shared locker where Marcus stored his few personal belongings. He carefully planted a thick manila envelope stuffed with $10,000 of marked Foundation cash into of Marcus's duffel bag, setting a trap that would completely destroy the boy's credibility and force LeBron to terminate the investigation. The following afternoon, the trap was sprung with calculated corporate precision during a mandatory assembly of the regional management team on the third floor. Two corporate security officers abruptly entered the maintenance break room, demanding that Marcus accompany them to the main executive suite due to a severe financial discrepancy reported in the upper offices. They dragged his worn duffel bag into the center of the conference room, dumping its meager contents across the polished mahogany table until the heavy envelope of cash slid out in front of 20 high-level executives. Vance stood near the window, his arms folded confidently as he looked down at Marcus, stating that the street kid had finally shown his true colors and that his presence was an insult to the Foundation's values. The room filled with a low, collective murmur of disgust from the staff, who whispered that an uneducated boy from North Akron could never be trusted around true wealth. Marcus stood entirely motionless against the wall, his face pale but his eyes remaining intensely focused as the false accusations rained down on his character. He looked down at the envelope of money, then looked up at LeBron James, who sat at the head of the long table with his hands clasped together, his face revealing absolutely nothing to the room. Marcus quietly stated that he had never touched the money, that he had spent his entire life learning how to go hungry without ever becoming a thief. Vance laughed out loud, demanding an immediate termination and police intervention, claiming that physical evidence was the only truth that mattered in a professional institution. LeBron slowly stood up from his chair, his massive frame instantly casting a long shadow across the polished table as he called for absolute silence in the room. He didn't look at the money. Instead, he directed the tech security team to pull up the high-definition internal surveillance footage from the basement corridor recorded at 10:45 the previous evening. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life, revealing a clear, undeniable angle of Preston Vance walking down the dark hallway, looking nervously over his shoulder before opening Marcus's locker and sliding the manila envelope inside. The room went completely dead quiet, the temperature dropping instantly as the executives stared at the screen in total shock, while Vance's confident posture cracked entirely, his hands beginning to tremble as the weight of his own trap collapsed upon him. The silence inside the executive conference room was absolute, pressing against the ears of the senior staff like the heavy, freezing air of an Ohio blizzard. The high-definition monitor continued to loop the security footage, showing the unmistakable profile of Preston Vance walking down the basement corridor and the stolen funds inside the maintenance locker. Two city detectives, who had been quietly brought into the building, by LeBron's private legal counsel hours before the meeting, stepped out from the rear shadows of the room. Their heavy boots clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor as they moved toward the chief financial officer, their expressions carved from stone. Vance stood completely frozen by the window, his face drained of all color, his eyes darting frantically from the screen to the faces of the board members who were already turning away from him in deep disgust. One of the detectives stepped forward and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, instructing Vance to place his hands behind his back without creating a scene. The arrogant composure that had defined the executive for decades cracked entirely, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the metallic rings clicked tightly around his wrists. He did not launch into a theatrical defense. Instead, he looked down at his own polished shoes, the crushing weight of his public downfall forcing his shoulders to slump forward in total defeat. As he was led toward the exit, Vance paused for a fraction of a second in front of Marcus, his voice trembling with a mixture of intense bitterness and profound realization. He whispered that he had spent his entire life believing that money could buy total immunity, and that a kid from the streets could always be used as a shield. But he now realized his arrogance had blinded him to the simplest truths of human decency. LeBron James stood at the head of the table, his eyes remaining fixed on the disgraced executive until the heavy glass doors closed behind the officers. He then turned his attention to the rest of the management team, his voice dropping into a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the structure of the room. He stated that the foundation was built on a sacred covenant with the children of Akron, a promise that could never be compromised by the greed of the people sitting in the high-backed chairs. He explained that Marcus had carried more integrity in his worn-out sneakers than the entire financial department had demonstrated over the past fiscal year. The executives remained completely motionless, their heads bowed under the weight of the correction, realizing that the survival of their institution depended entirely on reclaiming the honesty they had so easily forgotten. 3 months passed, and the bitter winter snow of Akron slowly melted away, giving way to the pale green shoots of an early Ohio spring. The financial department of the foundation had been completely overhauled, its old, corrupt systems dismantled under the strict oversight of independent federal auditors. The money that Preston Vance had spent years funneling into offshore accounts was systematically tracked down, frozen, and returned to the primary educational funds where it belonged. The public classrooms in North Akron, which had been suffering from a lack of basic supplies and underfunded after-school programs, were finally infused with the resources they had been promised. The atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters shifted dramatically. The old culture of cold arrogance, replaced by a quiet, collective reminder that every dollar moving through the building belonged to the children outside its walls. Marcus no longer wore the oversized, faded maintenance uniform that had marked him as an outsider on his very first day in the building. LeBron James had personally overseen his transition into a newly created role within the Foundation's Community Outreach Division, providing him with a quiet, sunlit workspace on the second floor. Marcus's new responsibilities involved visiting the local community shelters, sitting across the table from families who were navigating the exact same darkness he had survived, and listening to their stories without a single ounce of judgment. He used his first real paycheck to secure a modest, warm apartment on the south side of the city, ensuring his grandmother had access to proper medical care and a room where the winter wind could no longer reach her. The lines of deep exhaustion that had defined his young face for years began to soften, replaced by a steady, quiet confidence that came from knowing he had earned his place through unshakable endurance. On a warm afternoon in late April, LeBron called Marcus into the top-floor executive office, the large windows revealing a panoramic view of the city they both called home. He reached into his desk drawer and extracted a thick, official manila envelope, sliding it across the polished wooden surface toward the young man. Inside was a full tuition scholarship to the University of Akron, paired with a permanent, paid internship within the Foundation's leadership program upon his enrollment. LeBron looked at Marcus with a slow, proud nod, stating that true education was not something that could be bought with a family name or corporate connections, but something that belonged to those who held on to their values when the world offered them every reason to break. Marcus held the silver key to his new life in his hands, his throat tightening with an overwhelming wave of gratitude as he realized the promise he had made to his mother had finally brought him into the light. The annual benefit gala of the foundation was held on a cool, star-lit Saturday evening in late May. The large banquet hall on the third floor, completely transformed by soft ambient lighting and the low murmur of hundreds of distinguished guests. The very same room that Marcus had scrubbed on his hands and knees months ago was now filled with educators, community leaders, and global partners who had gathered to celebrate the renewal of the organization's mission. Marcus stood near the glass doors of the balcony, dressed in a simple, perfectly fitted dark suit, watching the reflection of the city lights dancing on the surface of the Cuyahoga River. He didn't feel the old exhausting anxiety that used to tighten his chest whenever he entered a wealthy space. Instead, he felt a deep, unshakable stillness that belonged to a person who had conquered his own shadow. When his name was called from the main podium, Marcus took a slow, deep breath and walked down the center aisle, the crowd falling into an immediate respectful silence as he took his place behind the microphone. He didn't deliver a polished, theatrical speech about corporate success or strategic philanthropy. Instead, he spoke with the quiet, devastating clarity of someone who remembered the exact temperature of a concrete floor in December. He told them about the cardboard bed behind the laundromat, the dark brown leather wallet sitting in the slush, and the agonizing hollow pull of hunger that had begged him to take the easy way out. He spoke about his mother's final words and the faded green rubber band that had kept him whole when the rest of the world looked at his ragged shoes and assumed he was nothing but a thief. As he finished his speech, stating that the true worth of a human being can never be measured by what they possess, but by what they refuse to sell, the entire ballroom rose to its feet in a massive, thunderous ovation. In the very front row, his grandmother sat wrapped in a beautiful new shawl, tears of profound pride rolling down her wrinkled cheeks as she smiled up at him. Marcus stepped away from the podium and walked back toward the shadows of the wings, where LeBron James stood waiting near the corridor, completely away from the flash bulbs of the media. The global icon didn't offer a dramatic speech or a public handshake for the cameras. He simply reached out and clapped Marcus firmly on the shoulder, a warm, genuine smile breaking across his broad face. It was the quiet, sacred acknowledgement of one Akron son to another, a silent validation that an honest choice made by someone the world had entirely forgotten had possessed the immense, quiet power to shake everything.